Well, good evening from London. Welcome to Piers Morgan Uncensored. Today, Harry and Meghan torched what little was left of their relationship with the royal family and what little was left, frankly, of their own reputations. Last week was mostly sycophantic. This latest instalment was downright series, released to the world this morning, is packed with, well, they're not really revelations, are they? It's sort of rehashed old revelations with a new twist. As it turns out, we've apparently been wrong all along. Britain is a nasty, racist hellhole where only magnificent Meghan stood up to all this, and the world's biggest victims are not the people of Ukraine or the people battling COVID or people struggling in a devastating cost of living crisis. No, the world's biggest victims right now are the Duke and Duchess of...
But it could happen to absolutely anybody. I mean, we always talk about, in the olden days, if your kids were under your roof, you knew what they were up to. At least they were safe, right? And now they can be in the next door room on a tablet or on a phone and can be going down these rabbit holes. And before you know it, within 24 hours, they could be...
It did not begin with a court ruling. It did not arrive through medical records. It began on television. When Piers Morgan claimed he had uncovered contradictions in the public pregnancy timeline presented by Meghan Markle, the reaction was instant and unforgiving. Clips circulated, panels split, and within hours, a familiar question returned with new force. What happens when media scrutiny collides with a story long treated as untouchable? At the center of the storm stood Prince Harry, facing speculation that the latest claims had pushed an already fragile situation past the point of repair. Today, we trace how Morgan's assertions reignited dormant doubts, why the palace chose silence, and how a dispute framed as investigation reshaped the Sussex narrative once again. The spark did not come from a court or a clinic. It came from a studio desk, under hot lights, with a presenter who understands exactly how to frame doubt. On a weekday evening broadcast, Piers Morgan returned to a subject many editors believed had been settled years earlier. He did not allege a crime. He did not present documents. He asked questions and pointed to what he described as contradictions in the public pregnancy timeline offered by Meghan Markle. The phrasing was deliberate. Morgan spoke about dates, appearances, and descriptions given at different moments, suggesting they did not align cleanly. He emphasized that he was raising issues of narrative consistency, not medical diagnosis. The distinction mattered legally, but it landed the same way with audiences. Clips spread within minutes. Producers at rival networks recognized the shift immediately. This was not a social media rumor. This was a prime-time challenge framed as investigation. The effect was to reclassify old whispers into a fresh controversy, not because anything new had been proven, but because the messenger had changed. Within hours, panels assembled. Some dismissed Morgan as a long-standing antagonist of the Sussexes. Others acknowledged his track record of forcing stories back into circulation through repetition and framing. What united both camps was recognition of their sensitivity. Pregnancy narratives in royal life sit behind a glass wall. They are protected by privacy norms and institutional caution. Morgan had just tapped that glass. Editors revisited footage. Public statements were replayed. Analysts placed screenshots side by side, noting how descriptions of timing and circumstances evolved across interviews and appearances. The tone on air was careful. Words like alleged, claimed, and questioned dominated. Yet the visual grammar did its work, pairing studio debate with exterior shots of Buckingham Palace and the Portland Hospital, a facility long associated in the public mind with royal maternity, without confirming any specific detail. Inside palace offices, the reaction was split. Royal correspondents described two immediate instincts colliding. One faction argued for absolute distance. Pregnancy stories, they said, are not to be litigated publicly. Engaging would violate a line the institution rarely crosses. The other faction worried that televised doubt, left unanswered, would harden into assumed discrepancy, particularly when anchored to visuals and repeated questioning. That internal divide slowed any response to a crawl. The human drama intensified in California. Commentators sympathetic to Meghan described the segment as a targeted attempt to humiliate, reviving speculation that should have remained buried. Critics argued that public figures who tell public stories invite scrutiny when inconsistencies are alleged. Both sides circled the same fact. Nothing had been proven, yet the pressure was mounting. At the center of that pressure stood Prince Harry. Coverage pivoted quickly to him, not for what he said, but for what he did not. There were no immediate briefings attributed to Harry. No attempt to contextualize Morgan's claims as malicious or unfounded. Analysts noted the contrast with earlier controversies, when Harry often moved swiftly to defend or reframe. The silence was read two ways. Supporters called it restraint, critics called it strain. Morgan returned to the subject the following night, tightening his focus. He reiterated that he was asking questions others refused to ask. He cited public appearances, wardrobe choices, and interview phrasing, arguing that taken together they merited scrutiny. Again, no documents. Again, no allegations. The repetition mattered. Doubt gains force through cadence. Newsrooms faced a dilemma. Ignore the segment and risk being overtaken by it, or cover it and risk amplifying speculation. Many chose a middle path, reporting on the reaction rather than the claims. That choice extended the life of the story without adjudicating it. Behind the scenes, legal advisors weighed in. Pregnancy narratives are shielded by medical privacy. Any definitive rebuttal would require details no institution would release. That reality boxed in potential responses. Silence protected privacy. Silence also surrendered narrative ground. As the cycle accelerated, online commentary surged ahead of broadcast caution. Timelines were drawn, appearances were dissected frame by frame. None of this was verified. Much of it conflicted. Yet repetition created a sense of inevitability. What began as a television segment became a monitoring event. The antagonist structure sharpened. On one side stood a broadcaster wielding questions and cadence. On the other stood an institution bound by restraint. Between them stood Meghan, facing scrutiny without accusation, and Harry, positioned as the hinge between defense and distance. By the end of the first day, the story had changed temperature. It was no longer about whether Morgan was right. It was about whether anyone with authority would contradict him. The absence of contradiction did not confirm his claims. It did something quieter and more durable. It allowed doubt to settle. In royal coverage, that is often enough to move a story from provocation to problem. By the second day, the story had shifted from broadcast provocation to institutional stress test. The questions raised on air by Piers Morgan were no longer being debated solely on their merits. They were being measured against the response they did not receive. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors confronted a familiar dilemma sharpened by modern media dynamics: whether silence would protect privacy or invite interpretation. Two factions emerged quickly. One group argued that pregnancy narratives sit behind an absolute wall. Medical timelines, hospital protocols, and personal health details are not to be litigated publicly. Engaging would cross a line the institution rarely approaches, let alone crosses. The opposing faction warned that televised doubt, repeated with discipline, would metastasize if left unanswered. They argued that restraint, once a shield, now risked becoming an accelerant. The stalemate held. As the palace deliberated, coverage widened to include the Sussex household itself. Commentators emphasized that Meghan Markle had not been accused of wrongdoing. Yet they also noted that Morgan's framing avoided accusation by design. He focused on narrative consistency, not medical proof, a strategy that left little for institutions to rebut without breaching privacy. Panels dissected the segment line by line. Analysts replayed interviews, press moments, and public appearances, careful to couch observations in conditional language. Words like appears, suggests, and raises questions dominated. Visuals did the rest. Exterior shots of the Portland hospital were paired with stills from televised interviews, not to assert a link, but to evoke one. Anchors cautioned viewers against inference, even as the montage implied process and protocol. The pressure migrated toward Prince Harry. Harry's absence from the response became the story's hinge. Royal analysts noted that in previous controversies, he often intervened, sometimes emotionally, sometimes strategically, to reframe disputes as matters of fairness or mental health. This time, there were no attributed briefings, no supportive context, no effort to redirect focus. Legal experts suggested counsel had narrowed options to silence. Others interpreted the quiet as strain, the weight of a controversy that touched something deeply personal. The marriage itself became a lens. Commentators debated whether the pressure was external or internal, whether Harry's restraint signaled unity or exhaustion. Supporters argued that refusing to engage protected their family. Critics countered that silence ceded ground to a broadcaster skilled at repetition. Both readings gained traction because neither could be disproven. Inside newsrooms, editors faced their own bind. Publishing a definitive rebuttal was impossible without medical disclosure. Ignoring the story risked being overtaken by it. Many outlets chose to cover the reaction rather than the claims, a strategy that extended the cycle without adjudicating it. Each segment that asked, "Why no response?" kept the issue alive. Online, restraint vanished. Commentary channels stitched together timelines, wardrobe analyses, and offhand remarks from interviews years apart. None of it was verified. Much of it contradicted itself. Yet repetition created familiarity, and familiarity bred belief. Royal advisors monitoring the digital space acknowledged a hard truth. Once doubt is framed as question rather than accusation, it is nearly impossible to close without authority willing to speak. That authority did not speak. The palace maintained distance, calculating that engagement would invite demands for proof it could not provide. Legal advisors emphasized the risks of defamation by implication and the sanctity of medical privacy. The institution chose principle over reassurance, accepting short-term turbulence to avoid a precedent it could not unwind. For Meghan, the effect was asymmetric. She faced scrutiny without charge, interrogation without allegation. Supporters described the coverage as punitive, a replay of earlier media hostility dressed in investigative language. Critics argued that public narratives invite public questions when inconsistencies are alleged. The debate hardened because it rested on belief rather than fact. Morgan returned to the subject with disciplined cadence, reiterating that he was asking what others would not. He cited no new evidence. He did not need to. The repetition itself became evidence of persistence. Each return to the topic reset the clock, forcing editors to decide again whether to ignore or engage. By evening, the language of coverage shifted. Controversy gave way to pressure. Claims gave way to questions. The story matured without resolving anything. It no longer required new material. It fed on the absence of response. The antagonist structure was now clear. On one side stood a broadcaster leveraging cadence and framing. On the other stood an institution bound by restraint and privacy. Between them stood a couple absorbing scrutiny, with Harry positioned as the fulcrum between defense and withdrawal. As night fell, one reality settled across royal desks and media studios alike. The story had moved beyond what was said on television. It was now about what was not being said anywhere else. And in a media environment where silence is interpreted as strategy, that absence carried its own meaning. The pressure did not break anything visibly. It did something quieter. It reset expectations for what might come next, and for how long doubt could persist without proof. By the third day, the story no longer depended on what Piers Morgan had actually said on air. It depended on what had not been said since. The absence of contradiction had become the fuel. Panels stopped replaying the original segment and began debating the implications of silence itself. In modern royal coverage, that shift is decisive. It marks the moment when a question becomes a frame. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors acknowledged that the calculus had changed. The institution's instinct to protect medical privacy had collided with a media environment that treats unanswered questions as unresolved problems. Two camps remained entrenched. One insisted that engaging would force disclosures no palace should ever make. The other warned that allowing doubt to circulate unchecked would allow it to be misremembered as fact. The choice held: silence. That decision had consequences beyond the palace. It reframed the pressure on Meghan Markle in ways that were difficult to counter. Coverage grew colder, more analytical. Commentators spoke less about emotion and more about record. They emphasized that Morgan had not alleged medical fraud. He had alleged inconsistency. That distinction matters because inconsistency can be debated without violating privacy, yet it cannot be conclusively disproven without authority willing to speak. The imagery reinforced the frame. Broadcasts juxtaposed interview clips, press appearances, and exterior shots of Portland Hospital, careful to state that no medical details were confirmed. The effect was not to prove anything, but to suggest process and protocol against personal narrative. Viewers were invited to infer without being told to. For Prince Harry, the pressure became personal and public at once. Analysts noted his continued absence from the conversation. In earlier disputes, Harry often positioned himself as defender and translator, reframing criticism as harm and insisting on empathy. This time, he did not. No attributed briefings appeared. No contextual interviews surfaced. The silence was read as restraint by supporters and as exhaustion by critics. That ambiguity became part of the story. Royal commentators argued that pregnancy narratives are uniquely symbolic. They speak to continuity, lineage, and trust. When questions are raised about such narratives, even indirectly, the institution's refusal to engage can feel like distance rather than protection. That perception does not require proof to persist. It requires repetition. Meghan returned to the subject with the same cadence, insisting he was asking questions others avoided. He offered no new material. He did not need to. Each return reset the cycle, forcing editors to decide again whether to ignore or engage. Many chose to engage cautiously, discussing the reaction rather than the claim. The result was endurance without escalation. Online discourse accelerated beyond broadcast restraint. Timelines were assembled from disparate clips. Wardrobe choices were analyzed. Offhand remarks from interviews years apart were compared as if they belonged to a single record. None of this was verified. Much of it contradicted itself. Yet repetition created familiarity, and familiarity created confidence. Royal advisors monitoring the digital space recognized the pattern. Once doubt is framed as inquiry, it becomes almost impossible to close. The antagonist structure solidified. On one side stood a broadcaster leveraging repetition and framing. On the other stood institutions bound by privacy and precedent. Between them stood a couple absorbing scrutiny without allegation and without resolution. That middle position is the most exposed because it offers no clean rebuttal. As the week progressed, the language of coverage shifted again. Questions became doubts. Doubts became concerns. Each shift moved the story further from its origin and closer to permanence. Editors acknowledged privately that even if the story faded from headlines, it would remain as context, referenced obliquely in future discussions. For Meghan, the cost was reputational rather than legal. She was not accused of wrongdoing. She was portrayed as embattled by narrative challenge. Supporters argued that this was the inevitable result of a hostile media ecosystem. Critics argued that public stories invite public scrutiny when inconsistencies are alleged. The debate hardened because it operated on belief rather than evidence. For Harry, the cost appeared different. Analysts suggested the episode marked a breaking point, not because of any single claim, but because of accumulation. Years of scrutiny, compounded by a story touching something intimate, had narrowed his options. Speaking risked escalation. Silence risked misinterpretation. Distance risked alienation. Each choice carried consequence. Inside palace circles, advisors warned of the long arc. Doubt that is not resolved does not disappear. It becomes part of the archive. Biographies reference it cautiously. Panels recall it as background. Search results preserve it. That is how unresolved questions endure. By the end of the cycle, nothing definitive had been established. No records were produced. No allegations were substantiated. Yet, the impact was undeniable. The story had shifted from provocation to reference. That transition is often the most damaging because it no longer requires new material to survive. Royal correspondents emphasized a sobering lesson. In the modern monarchy, perception often outruns proof. When a question is framed as investigation and met with silence, it acquires a life of its own. Correcting it later requires authority willing to speak with clarity equal to the doubt. In this case, no such authority emerged. The episode did not end with a statement or a denial. It ended with expectation. Expectation that questions would linger. Expectation that future appearances would be read through this lens. Expectation that silence would continue to be interpreted. In royal history, many controversies flare and fade. The ones that endure are rarely the loudest. They are the unresolved ones, the questions that were never closed because closing them required choices no institution was willing to make. Here, the choice was restraint. The consequence was doubt. And in a media environment that rewards repetition over resolution, doubt does not need proof to persist. It only needs time. In royal life, questions can be as damaging as answers. Subscribe, like, and share for deeper investigations into monarchy, media power, and the stories that redefine public trust. Because once doubt takes hold, it rarely fades quietly.